This is what's happening in the world at the moment Jesus was crucified. While Jesus was breathing his last breath on a cross outside Jerusalem, the Roman Empire was at the height of its power. But Rome was troubled. The emperor who sat on the throne that day wasn't the great Augustus who had ruled when Jesus was born. Augustus had died 17 years earlier. The man who now controlled the fate of the world was Tiberius Caesar. And Tiberius was nothing like his predecessor. Augustus had been a political genius, beloved by the people, a builder of empires, roads and monuments. Tiberius was cold, suspicious, and deeply paranoid. He had retreated from Rome entirely, abandoning the capital to rule from the island of Capri off the coast of Italy, surrounded by luxury and rumors of depravity. He hadn't set foot in Rome in over a decade. He governed through fear and letters, and the city trembled in his absence. But Tiberius had a problem. His absence had created a vacuum of power, and into that vacuum stepped one of the most dangerous men in Roman history. His name was Sejanus. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose only purpose was to protect the emperor. He was charming, ruthless, and brilliant. And while Tiberius hid on his island, Sejanus quietly became the true ruler of Rome. He controlled who could speak to the emperor. He eliminated political rivals through false accusations of treason. He had Tiberius's own son poisoned. And now he was plotting to marry into the imperial family and seize the throne itself. On the day Jesus was crucified, Rome was a city living under a reign of terror, where senators feared each other, where a careless word could mean death, where no one trusted anyone. The empire that crucified the Son of God was rotting from within. And the man who made the decision to crucify him? Pontius Pilate. Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea, appointed not by popularity, but by political connection. He had arrived in Judea around 26 AD and had already clashed violently with the Jewish population multiple times. He had marched Roman standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem, an act considered a desecration. He had raided the temple treasury to fund an aqueduct. He had massacred Galilean pilgrims in the temple courts. He was a man who ruled by intimidation, not wisdom. Yet on this particular day, he hesitated. He saw no crime in the man standing before him. He tried to release him. He sent him to Herod Antipas. He offered to free a prisoner, as was custom, and when none of it worked, he washed his hands of it. Pilate would not survive much longer. Just a few years after the crucifixion, he would order a massacre of Samaritans on Mount Gerizim and be recalled to Rome to stand trial. He disappears from history after that. Some accounts say he died in exile, others say by suicide. The man who sent Jesus to the cross would lose everything. But on that Friday morning, none of that mattered yet. Jesus was nailed to the cross at 9 in the morning, and at that very hour, across the Roman Empire, life was continuing as if nothing had happened. In Rome itself, the Senate was meeting. Senators were drafting new treason laws, denouncing each other to seek favor with the absent emperor. The forums were buzzing with merchants and lawyers and philosophers. The gladiatorial games were being planned. The baths were full. Life in the capital of the world moved at its usual frantic pace, completely unaware that on a hill in an obscure corner of Judea, the hinge of all human history was swinging. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean in Alexandria, Egypt, something extraordinary was quietly happening. Alexandria was arguably the intellectual capital of the world. Its great library, the Museion, held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars from across the known world gathered there to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. At this very time, a man named Philo of Alexandria was writing. Philo was a Jewish philosopher who spent his life trying to reconcile the Torah with Greek philosophy, particularly the ideas of Plato. He wrote about the Logos, the divine word or reason, through which God created and ordered the universe. He described it as a bridge between the infinite God and the finite world. He likely never heard of Jesus of Nazareth. But decades later, when the Apostle John began his gospel with the words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," a Greek-educated audience would have understood immediately. The intellectual groundwork for the message of Christ had been quietly laid in the libraries of Alexandria. God was preparing the world to understand what was happening on that cross. While Jesus hung between earth and sky, to the east, the Parthian Empire was in turmoil. Persia, Rome's great rival, was bleeding from within. The Parthian nobility was locked in a succession crisis that had been going on for years. Rival claimants to the throne fought proxy wars. Roman emperors meddled in Parthian succession to keep them weak. The great Eastern superpower that Rome had never conquered, the empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the borders of India, was fracturing under its own aristocratic feuds. And yet trade still flowed, because no war could stop the Silk Road. Even in those turbulent years, the caravans kept moving. Silk from China, spices from India, incense from Arabia, glass from Rome, ideas, rumors, religions, stories, all of it moving slowly across thousands of miles. And while none of those traders knew it yet, a new story was beginning that day in Jerusalem that would eventually travel every single one of those routes. Now let's look further east. In India, Buddhism was expanding. The great emperor Ashoka had died about 230 years before the crucifixion, but not before spreading Buddhism across his vast kingdom and sending missionaries as far as Egypt and Greece. By the time Jesus was crucified, Buddhism had already taken root in Central Asia and was beginning to reach China along the very trade routes the apostles would later use. The world was spiritually hungry. Everywhere, people were reaching for something greater than themselves. They were searching for answers to suffering, for the nature of the divine, and for what happens after death. In the Tamil kingdoms of southern India, trade with Rome was flourishing. Roman coins have been found by archaeologists in Tamil Nadu. Roman merchants lived in Indian port cities. Indian spices and Roman gold flowed back and forth. These were not isolated civilizations. They were connected in ways most people never imagine. And what of China on that day? The Han dynasty was in a period of recovery. Just over a decade before the crucifixion, the usurper Wang Mang had briefly overthrown the Han and declared his own Xin dynasty. He had attempted radical reforms, abolishing slavery, nationalizing land, reforming currency. The people had resisted. Floods, famines, and peasant revolts consumed his reign. He was killed by a mob in 23 AD, just 7 years before the crucifixion. The Han dynasty had been restored by Emperor Guangwu, and China was slowly rebuilding, emerging from years of chaos. On the day of the crucifixion, the restored Han court in Luoyang was consolidating power, managing border conflicts with nomadic peoples to the north and west, and rebuilding trade networks. The new emperor was intelligent and reform-minded. He would go on to create one of the most stable periods in Chinese history. But on that particular Friday, he was simply trying to hold together a fractured empire. He had no idea that across the world, a Jewish carpenter was dying on a cross in a way that would eventually send missionaries traveling the Silk Road all the way to China. Now look up at the sky itself, because something was happening that day that went beyond politics and trade and empire. The Gospels record it plainly, and it is one of the most remarkable events in the history of the ancient world. At noon, when the sun was at its highest point, darkness fell over the entire land for 3 hours, from noon to 3 in the afternoon. This was not a solar eclipse. Solar eclipses during Passover are impossible, because Passover falls on a full moon, and eclipses only happen on a new moon. This was something else entirely. The Roman historian Phlegon of Tralles, who was not a Christian, wrote about an extraordinary darkness and an earthquake that occurred during the reign of Tiberius. The early Christian writer Origen quoted him on it. Thales, another non-Christian historian writing in the 1st century, also mentioned the darkness, trying to explain it as a solar eclipse, which is precisely the kind of explanation a skeptic would reach for if he knew it had happened but didn't want to accept the implications. The darkness was real. And in a world where the sky told you everything about the mood of the gods, 3 hours of midday darkness over the holy city of Jerusalem during Passover was a catastrophic omen. People who were not there would have heard about it. Travelers on the road to Egypt would have seen it. Sailors in the Mediterranean would have noticed it. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem would have felt it. And at 3 in the afternoon, when the darkness ended, the earth shook. Matthew records that the veil of the temple, the massive curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, tore from top to bottom. This was not a small piece of fabric. Ancient sources describe it as being as thick as a man's fist and 60 feet tall, and it tore from the top down as if pulled apart by an invisible hand from above. In that moment, something that had been closed for 1,000 years was opened. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies once a year, alone, on the Day of Atonement, trembling with the weight of Israel's sins. It was the most sacred act in all of Judaism, and now the curtain was gone. The barrier between God and man had been removed, not by a priest, not by a ritual, but by a death. The Roman centurion who stood at the foot of the cross and watched Jesus die said something that no Roman soldier had ever said about any Jew. He said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." That statement from a pagan soldier of the most powerful empire on earth at the foot of a cross is one of the most stunning moments in all of Scripture. This was a man trained to execute rebels. He had probably overseen dozens of crucifixions. And something about the way Jesus died, the darkness, the earthquake, the way he breathed his last, made this battle-hardened soldier stop and say something he could not explain. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem itself, the city was packed. Passover was the highest holy day in Judaism, and Jews from across the known world came to Jerusalem to celebrate it. There were Jews from Rome, from Alexandria, from Babylon, from Persia, from as far as Ethiopia and India. The population of Jerusalem during Passover swelled from about 30,000 to somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. It was the most crowded week of the year in the most important religious city in the world, and all of them felt the darkness. All of them felt the earth shake. Many of them would go home carrying the news of what had happened. Because word traveled fast in the ancient world, faster than most people realize. A traveler on horseback covering the Roman road network could reach Rome from Jerusalem in about a month. A ship with favorable winds could do it in 3 weeks. News of remarkable events, a darkness at noon, an earthquake, a man who was executed and then reported to have risen from the dead, would spread through the synagogue networks across the empire. By the time Paul began his missionary journeys 20 years later, he would arrive in cities and find people who already knew something about Jesus. God had not placed Jerusalem in an obscure corner of the world by accident. Jerusalem sat at the crossroads of 3 continents. Africa was a week's journey to the southwest. Asia stretched endlessly to the east. Europe began just across the Mediterranean to the north. Every major trade route passed through or near the land of Israel. The Romans had built their roads through it. The Silk Road brushed its borders. The sea lanes of the Mediterranean connected it to the entire Western world. The cross stood at the center of the world. Now, far to the west, in the forests and highlands of Britain, people called the Celts and the early Britons were living under Roman occupation. Julius Caesar had first invaded Britain nearly a century before. Now Roman legions guarded the south. Celtic tribes resisted in the north and west. Druids, the religious leaders of the Celtic peoples, presided over sacred groves, offering sacrifices and reading omens. Britain was one of the most distant frontiers of the empire, a damp, cold island at the edge of the known world. These people had never heard of Jesus of Nazareth. They had no idea that a man was dying that day in Jerusalem. Yet within a few centuries, the island would become one of the most deeply Christian places on earth. The story that began on that hill would reach even the foggy edges of the Roman world. And in the Americas, civilizations continued to rise and fall in complete isolation from everything happening in the Old World. The Maya were developing their mathematics, their calendar, constructing cities in the jungles of what is now Mexico and Guatemala. The people of Teotihuacan were building their great city of pyramids near what would one day be Mexico City. In the Andes, cultures were growing along the Pacific coast. None of them knew. None of them could have known. The Americas would not hear the name of Jesus for another 15 centuries. But God's plan was not on a Roman timetable. Back in Jerusalem, as the sun began to move toward evening, two men made a decision that took extraordinary courage. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the same council that had condemned Jesus. But Joseph had not agreed with their decision. He had been a secret disciple, afraid of what his fellow religious leaders would say. That evening, he stopped being afraid. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. This was not a small request. To publicly claim the body of a man executed for treason against Rome was to associate yourself with him. It was to paint a target on your back. Joseph of Arimathea was risking his reputation, his position, possibly his life, and he went anyway. He was joined by Nicodemus, another Pharisee and member of the Sanhedrin, the same man who had come to Jesus secretly by night years before, asking about being born again. Nicodemus came now, in the open, carrying 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, a burial preparation fit for a king. Together, these two unlikely men, powerful and prominent and suddenly, publicly, unafraid, wrapped the body of Jesus in linen with the spices and laid him in a new tomb. The Sabbath was coming. The sun was setting. Jerusalem fell quiet. The disciples were scattered, grieving, hiding behind locked doors in the upper city. The women who had stood at the foot of the cross watched where the tomb was and then went to prepare more spices. The religious leaders asked Pilate to post a guard at the tomb, afraid of rumors about a resurrection. The Roman soldiers took their posts. The stone was sealed. And at that moment, to all the world, it was over. Rome still ruled. Tiberius still hid on his island. Sejanus still plotted in Rome. The Parthians still fought each other in the east. The Han Emperor still rebuilt China in the west. The Silk Road still moved its caravans. The Maya still raised their pyramids. The Celtic Druids still read their omens in the forests of Britain. The scholars of Alexandria still wrote their philosophy. The world turned on its axis, completely unchanged. Or so it seemed. Because in a garden tomb just outside the walls of Jerusalem, something was about to happen that no emperor had a category for, that no philosopher had a framework for, that no religion on earth had ever claimed before. Not a myth about a god dying and rising with the seasons, not a story told around a fire. A real man in a real tomb, watched by real soldiers, in the most documented corner of the most record-keeping empire the world had ever seen. On the third day, the stone was rolled away. Not so Jesus could get out. He was already gone. It was rolled away so those who came looking could see in. The tomb was empty. And when that news began to travel, it traveled the Roman roads. It traveled the sea lanes. It traveled the synagogue networks. It traveled the Silk Road. Within one generation, the message of a crucified and risen Jewish carpenter from Galilee had reached Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Carthage, and Babylon. Within 3 centuries, it had reached Britain. Within 5, it had reached China. Within 15, it had crossed the ocean to the Americas. No movement in the history of the world began this way. Every empire builds itself on armies and taxes and fear. The kingdom that was born on that cross built itself on something no emperor could manufacture or destroy. It built itself on the news that death had been defeated. And the world, which had been searching for that news since the beginning of time, in the Zoroastrian prayers of Persia, in the Buddhist meditations of India, in the ancestral ceremonies of China, in the philosophical dialogues of Greece, in the mystery religions of Rome, in the pyramids of Egypt and the Maya, in the sacred groves of Britain, in all of it, had been getting ready without knowing it. It is finished. Those were not the words of a man defeated. They were the declaration of a mission completed, a sacrifice accepted, a door opened, the curtain torn from top to bottom by the hand that hung the stars. And while the world spun on, oblivious, the greatest event in human history was 3 days away from becoming undeniable. The stone would not hold. The first followers of Jesus went from hiding in fear to turning the entire Roman Empire upside down. 12 ordinary men from a forgotten corner of Judea carried this message to the ends of the earth, and they refused to stop even when it meant their lives. Their story doesn't end at the empty tomb. It begins there, and it lives on in us today. Blessings to you and your family.